We also have to make sure that with regard to the government-sponsored medication-assisted treatment I referred to before, that we cannot simply rely on synthetic opioid maintenance alone. We have to make sure there are requirements to have that person in other counseling and treatment. I've heard from some persons that go to some of those treatment programs, they have no counseling at all, and some have great counseling. And in some cases, sitting in the waiting room, perhaps a nurse or someone simply checks up on them, how you doing, how's life, what are you doing? That's considered and written down as group therapy. That is not acceptable in any way, shape, and form. We need 100,000 more inpatient psychiatric beds, and we have to make sure insurance companies recognize that an addictive disorder is a chronic disorder. Simply giving someone a weekend or a few days for withdrawal and then put them back on the streets is not an answer. That's why we have to encourage private insurance companies and Medicaid and Medicare. And I say Medicare because a large number of people who are having some of these problems are also the elderly. We have to make sure that we increase the availability of fast-acting opiate blockers for first responders, such as Narcan. But let's keep in mind, in some cases we hear of some of those pushers of these drugs who also give an accompanied dosage of Narcan, recognizing that it'll bring that person to a near-death experience. We have heard from first responders and others, law enforcement, where someone may actually have a party, where someone will remain there expecting that someone will actually have an overdose and die, bring them back to life. That's how some of these people are seeking some of those experiences. We have to make sure that those who, that states review their laws, as some are doing, that if you take one of these opiates and you do have that near-death experience, perhaps that should be treated the same as a suicide attempt, that that person is in imminent danger of harming themselves or someone else, and perhaps determine if they need inpatient psychiatric stay. We have to make sure we have supportive employment for those in recovery to break the cycle of recovery and re-exposure. Many times persons who have, who are trying to stay clean because they can't get a job that deals with, they can't pass the drug test, they may be in a job that, that exposure to other people who still end up with substance abuse. We have to make sure they have higher standards and increased accountability for payment models and require evidence-based treatment in halfway houses, three-quarter houses, and residential treatment facilities. We have to deploy certified addictions counselors to emergency rooms, because when we know a person comes to an emergency room, if they see an addictions counselor near there, not just simply given a business card and say, call someone next week and we hope you get treatment, but if they see an addiction counselor in the emergency room, they increase their chances of follow-up by 50%, according to a Michigan study. We must make sure the FDA is working with companies to find alternatives to opioids, and that, again, Medicaid and other physicians are educated on some of those aspects. Physician training has to also be ramped up. Require them to have training in opioid prescribing practices, on risk for addiction, prescribing limited dosages instead of dosages for a month, perhaps just a couple days. Many cases they are not adequately trained in alternatives to opioids and the potential harms of overprescribing. We have to increase training requirements for healthcare providers who deliver this medication-assisted treatment. Right now, in many cases, they only have a few hours of training, and then they can go and prescribe this and have very little, if any, training at all in drug addictions counseling. Before doctors write a prescription, we can make that they have to make sure they're looking at the NASPR list or other lists as well. In the area of law enforcement, it's critical that what is called the high-intensity drug traffic areas are made more available with access to things around the country. Mr. Speaker, do you know how much time we have left in our segment here?
Gentleman has 7 minutes remaining.
Thank you. We have to make sure we have more border security, so we're intercepting these as they come across the border. We need funding for the post offices, because in many cases, unwittingly, the letter carriers are the ones who are carrying, delivering to people's homes fentanyl and other drugs. In the incarceration system, we have to make sure we're testing inmates for the presence of drugs in their system during their incarceration. We can offer for them medications which, when upon discharge, which actually blocks any effects of some of these drugs, so that they and that they have Medicaid and other insurance companies make sure that immediately upon release from incarceration, they take some of these drugs, that they get their Medicaid returned to them, so they don't simply relapse back into finding ways of selling drugs. We also have to make sure that we have solid data collection. In many cases, when we show these charts about death rates around the country, these may be grossly inaccurate, because in many cases, first responders and paramedics Coroners do not keep accurate data on these rates. The persons themselves may not even be tested to see if they died from a drug overdose. Several items in here of what we can be doing as a nation, and there is many more. The point is we have fallen short, and we have seen some problems with this. There is more that we can do and we must do in order to save lives. I know I just have about 3 minutes left, Mr. Speaker. Am I correct?
The gentleman has 5 minutes remaining.
5 minutes remaining. I'd like to yield 3 minutes to my friend from Ohio.